Thanks, Felicia. Welcome everybody to our embroidery stitching sampler. Today we're going to be learning a couple of basic embroidery stitches. So those of you who are joining me live, thank you so much for coming. I hope that you feel free to play along. If you have any kind of fabric, if you have any kinds of embroidery floss and a needle, go ahead and play along with us and stitch along. Also, I encourage you, if you already know how to embroider, just go ahead and have fun with us and just kind of work on one of your projects and just enjoy the time together. So we're so glad for the community who's here with us live. If you want to watch this video again, it will be available on YouTube on Monday. So if there's something you want to go back and redo or rewatch, you can always go back to our Michael's YouTube channel and check that out. And I also want to tell you about some upcoming classes. So I don't know if you know it or not, but February is National Embroidery Month. So that's why we're featuring a lot of different types of embroidery. I'm doing hand embroidery today, but yesterday we had a class where we did machine embroidery. So if you're interested in that, putting little embellishments onto sweatshirts and adding some machine embroidery onto sweatshirts. So that video is going to be available on YouTube today, so you can watch that. And another class coming up next week that I'm going to be teaching is going to be embellishing some photos using embroidery. So I have these amazing photos of my grandma from the 20s with her and someone who is not my grandpa, who she is kissing in this one. And so I added lots of cool stitches, and we're going to take some of the things that we learn in this particular class and then turn them into a totally different type of finished product. So let's go ahead and switch over to my other camera. And over here, you're going to see a nice embroidery hoop. You're going to see a nice little kind of monogram is what we're going to start with today. So I'm going to be using stencils. I'm going to be using embroidery floss from Loops and Thread, and I'm going to be using an embroidery needle from Loops and Thread. So this particular cotton fabric, we sell at Michael's lots of different fat quarters. So you can grab yourself a fat quarter of any kind of plain fabric. You can also get yourself Aida cloth. If you're not familiar with Aida cloth, this is a needlepoint pillow that I'm currently working on that says everything is fine. Everything is under control. But if you can kind of see the texture of this Aida cloth, it has the grid on it. And so your needle can go in between those different squares. So this is the kind of cloth that's very stiff and you might be more familiar with when it comes to things like needlepoint or cross stitch. So if you have Aida cloth and you want to use that today, that's a really good place to start with your embroidery because it has a grid kind of built in. But I'm going to freeform a little bit on some cotton fabric, so you're welcome to do that. Or really any kind of fabric that you have will also work. So I've done a class before where I've taken some tea towels or some napkins and done some of these same stitches you're going to learn today, and have this that we can add to make some like Thanksgiving napkins. So feel free to add these to some tea towels, to some napkins. You can embroider onto clothes. But today I'm just going to be showing you the sampler using some cotton fabric, using some black embroidery floss, and using this wooden hoop. So I'm going to go ahead and take off that, and I'm going to put down my new piece that we're going to work on together. And this is just from a fat quarter. It just happens to be yellow because I'm kind of into this right now. A little bit of yellow and a little bit of black thread to kind of give me that bumblebee feeling. And I'm tightening this fabric into my embroidery hoop, kind of pulling it, making it almost drum-like with its tightness. And then there are lots of different ways to transfer designs. The way that I'm going to utilize today is by using stencils. I think stencils are the fastest and the easiest way to transfer designs, but you can also use printed out. So if you have something printed out that you want to use, you can put it underneath a light color. You can already see how you can kind of see my finger outline. So if I had a design underneath that you would be able to see and trace. So that's one way to do it. And if the fabric is a little bit darker, you can put a light box, or you can even put the glow of your computer screen underneath here to kind of flash that image through the fabric to be able to see it. but I'm going to use some good old-fashioned stencils. We have such a great collection of stencils. We have these plastic stencils in so many different fonts and so many different sizes, depending on whatever kind of project you're going to make. If you don't want to do just one letter, if you want to do several letters, you can use smaller fonts. And we also have tons of paper stencils, like the one that I'm going to use today. And again, they come in different fonts and different sizes. This one's a nice size P that could really take up a lot of space and be pretty prominent if I wanted that to happen. And also in the stencils, you can do animals, you can do phrases. We have so many different options. So maybe if you wanted to do something with a little fox and maybe do a little cute embroidery for a child or for a blanket or something like that, you can add a little pop of giraffe onto something. So feel free to find the perfect design for you. And I am going to be focusing on this letter B today. And when you are tracing your pattern, there are lots of different types of pens that you can use when you're doing your embroidery. So if you want eventually the lines of your design to disappear, there are what are called like friction pens. And so the friction pen, if you put friction, if you rub on it, it disappears, the ink disappears afterwards. You can also get a washable marker. So when you go ahead and put down the design and then later on after you've stitched it, you can wash that line away. You can use a pencil very lightly that you're going to be able to kind of get rid of later on. Today, I'm going to be using a fine tip Sharpie because I want you at home to be able to see what I'm writing. And also because I don't really care, like if you can tell in this letter K, I used a black Sharpie on this one, and even when it gets to the part that's kind of dashed, I don't think you can really see my lines very much, so it just kind of blends into the design of the embroidery. So I'm going to be using a fine tip Sharpie to go ahead and trace the letter B, and we're going to walk through several of the basic embroidery stitches. And then those of you who are watching, if you have done some embroidery before, let me know some of the stitches that you use or some of the stitches that you're interested in learning. And maybe we'll have time to learn a couple of those other ones together. So I've just traced using my fine tip Sharpie, the letter B. And I'm going to go over about 3 different stitches to get us started, and then we're going to add from there. So the first stitch that's very basic to almost every embroidery piece is going to be the running stitch. So the running stitch is what allows us to have this dashed line, and it's just an up and down movement over and over again to create that dashed line. And then we're going to work on something called the back stitch, which basically takes the running stitch and fills it in. So this part of the letter K is the back stitch where it's a complete straight line. And then a stitch that may be new to some of you is going to be called the V stitch. Sometimes people call it the fly stitch. Some people call it the fan stitch. There's lots of different names for this particular stitch where we're going to kind of fill in with those diagonals, almost like a chevron. And then the last thing we'll learn together are French knots, just in case you've never done a French knot before, so that you can add a little bit of embellishment and flourish as well. So feel free to use whatever kind of design. Here's one that I did that is like a little Grecian vase. And then I added those same stitches. Here's the running stitch. Here's the back stitch going around. Here's my French knots. And then in this one, I added another stitch called the satin stitch. And the satin stitch really fills in a lot of area. And also another fun idea, especially right now since it's February and it is sweater weather, is I found this cute outline of a sweater on Canva, and I printed this out and I was able to draw this onto my fabric. And then I went from there and really did a sampler on this one too, where you see a lot of those same stitches, the fly stitch, that stitch that we're going to talk about later on too, and all the running stitches, and just kind of playing around with all the different textures and colors to make this adorable sweater. So let's get started. When you are using your embroidery floss, you want to cut no more than what I call a wingspan. So for me, a wingspan is stretching out my hand and kind of figuring out from my fingertips to about my, a little bit past my elbow is kind of my wingspan. You don't want to use too much more than that when you are getting started because it tends to tangle and get into knots pretty easily. So I'm using some black loops and thread embroidery floss, and this is 6-strand embroidery floss. We also have another type of embroidery floss that is already kind of wrapped up and doesn't have separate strands. So it's kind of all in one and you don't need to separate it. This one can be separated out. So it does have 6 strands that you can separate into thinner amounts if you want to. I'm actually going to go ahead and use this all-in-one that's already kind of twisted and pretty easy to be threaded. And I'm going to go ahead and cut myself a little length and thread my embroidery needle. So threading the embroidery needle is always going to be the most challenging part for embroiderers. There are, of course, some shortcuts where you can use a needle threader to help you out, but I'm going to try my best with my own 2 hands. And once I have this threaded, I'm going to tie a couple of knots on the end of my thread to keep my work from coming all the way through. And we are going to start together with the running stitch. And I'm going to be doing the running stitch along this inside curve of this portion of my letter B. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my needle and I'm underneath the fabric and I'm coming up through the fabric and I'm going to pull all the way through until my knot meets the fabric on the other side and stops it. And then with the running stitch, I'm going to follow this line and I'm going to go down probably about 1 centimeter next to where my stitch came up. And I'm going to go down in my fabric and pull this all the way through, being careful not to tangle and make too many knots. And then I'm going to leave about that same distance of about 1 centimeter before I come up again with my needle. And I left that dashed line because that is what the running stitch is all about. I'm going to go about 1 more centimeter and go down. And I was pulling pretty fast, which is how I'm getting this tangle. There we go. I'm going to come up. And just that up and down creates what we call the running stitch and makes for a really nice, cute dotted line. And do 1 more stitch kind of around the curve or the top of that portion of the letter B. And now going around this other portion of the B, I'm going to be doing the back stitch. So the back stitch is very, very similar to the running stitch. The only difference is that you're going to fill in those blanks by going backwards. So I'm going to come up a little bit further away from where I just left off. And I'm going to pull through. And instead of going forward, I'm going to go back to the stitch right before it and fill it in. Just like I was doing the running stitch before, I'm going to come up about 1 centimeter from where I left off. But instead of going forward, I'm going to go back to the stitch I just left off on and pull through. And I can continue this running stitch of coming up just about 1 centimeter ahead and going back to fill it in. And that creates what we call the back stitch. So I'm curious, those of you who are watching with me today, if you're playing along, do you have a project you're working on right now? And I'm also curious to know what level of embroiderer you are, if this is your very first class, or if you've done some of this before and you're just enjoying the time with us. So let me know in the chat who's here with me during class today and what you're up to. Here's my last stitch for the B. And I've completed that row. So I am going to go to the back. And when I'm finishing off my work on the back, I like to take my needle and maybe go through 1 or 2 of the stitches before, and then put my needle through the loop in order to create a nice knot that kind of secures onto stitches that are already there. And maybe just do 1 more for good measure. I'm going to slide under a stitch and slide my needle through that loop and pull. And then I can cut off my extra embroidery floss. And so far we have our running stitch and we have our back stitch. Now I'm going to fill in this B portion, the back line, with this stitch, sometimes called the feather stitch, sometimes called the fly stitch. You can kind of see how it has that cool chevron to it. So it looks like we have some people interested in a little bit of a refresher, which is perfect for us. I'm going to get just a little bit more of my embroidery floss ready for this next section, because it will take a little bit more to fill up this particular. Oh, good. We have some brand new people too. So I hope that you're learning just what you need to know to get yourself started and feel really confident. And cross stitch. Yes, cross stitch is so fun. You got to have the eyes, you got to have the patience, you got to have the hands. So there's a question that says, how do you know the difference between floss you have to separate and floss that you don't have to separate? And that's a good question. Let me see if I can show you. So this particular floss, let's see. I can find the end, and hopefully you can see this on your screen. You can see that there are several different strands. And so those strands can be taken apart. And the reason why we do this is because embroidery needles are so teeny tiny that sometimes you cannot fit all 6 of the strands through your embroidery needle at the same time. So you need to separate out 2 or 3. Or maybe you have some really fine detail that you want to work on, and then you need something with a thicker outline. So you can kind of vary the number of strands to help you vary that texture and that difference. And then this that I'm using right now, if you can tell, can you see that it's just a little bit braided? It's kind of twisted together. And what that does is it keeps any of those strands from coming apart. So there's no way for me to pull these strands apart because they're already kind of locked in together with that nice twist or that nice braid. So both of these embroidery flosses are great for the project that we're working on now. I just happen to be using this one that's twisted because it is a little bit easier to thread through my needle since it doesn't have a lot of separate strands. So great questions. Thanks for asking me. And we also have a couple of other people who are new and were gifted some floss. So yes, you need some more projects besides cross stitch. You have come to the right place. Now, if some of you get frustrated with embroidery or with cross stitch and the amount of time that it takes to do those projects, I got another thing up my sleeve for you. And this is called punch needle embroidery. You will never need to buy floss again. You are right. So this is called punch needle embroidery. And if your hands or you have some wrist issues or different mobility issues that kind of keep the teeny tiny stitches from kind of locks you up and you're having a hard time with that, this might be another craft to switch to, because punch needle uses this large needle with this hole in it, and you punch it through this monk's cloth. You literally punch it through. And when you punch it through, you're creating all these loops and you're creating all these stitches. And you don't have the same going under and pulling up and going under and pulling up. You just stab, 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 stab. So I particularly love punch needle because you don't have to do the up and down. You just have to do the stabbing. And it's faster, and you use yarn, or you can use embroidery floss. So consider both of those. So awesome. And it says we have some beeswax. Yep, Michael's. There are some great needle threaders. It's like a little balm, a little tube, not tube, a little, like, I don't know what to call it. Tin. It's like a little tin. And you can glide your floss across this beeswax, and then it helps you keep all the strands together. And then that's going to help you be able to thread your needle a lot easier too. There are little metal needle threaders that can help as well. Yay, so someone said they signed up for this punch needle class. This punch needle class with the mushroom is coming up, I believe, in March. Yeah, I believe it's in March. So feel free to sign up for that one. All right, we are ready for our next stitch. And the point of this stitch is going to be to make a stitch that covers the column for the letter B, but it's going to have a stitch that kind of comes down like a little arrow. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna come up on the left side, and I'm gonna pull my floss through. I'm going to be parallel on the other side, and I'm going to pull this down. Thanks, it's March 7th is the punch needle. Thanks, Jennifer. But before I pull this all the way through, the trick to this stitch is to come up through the middle and come up a little bit lower than where those two lines already are. So I'm going to pull my needle a little lower than those two lines, but in between them. And so when I pull this through now, that stitch I just made in the center stops it from finishing, and it holds it down. And then I'm going to tack that stitch down by taking my needle right on the other side of the loop and going down and through the fabric. So that's my first fly stitch, feather stitch. Then I'm going to start on the column again. Start on the left side, come down a little bit underneath that stitch with my needle. I'm going to go across the column and poke through on the other side of the letter B on that column. Before I pull this loop all the way through, I'm kind of holding it with my thumb because I don't want it to go all the way through, because I want to poke through in the center, but lower down. And you're trying to keep them even if possible in order to keep those V's kind of the same. And then I'm going to poke this down. And that's tacking that letter V down. And this is a great filler. Obviously, it takes up more space than something like the running stitch. And so it's nice to be able to fill in this whole column without doing too terribly many stitches. I'm holding this, keeping it from finishing, going down a little bit with my needle, pulling, and tacking that letter V down. We're doing it. I'm going to come up on the left side, go down on the right side. I'm holding it, stopping it underneath the other two stitches, but in between them. Tack that down. Now, if you're worried about your stitches not being perfectly even, you can use a ruler and literally draw dots on your line so that you know where you want your stitches to be and guarantee that those stitches are going to be exactly the same distance apart. So that's a good way for you to be able to kind of keep yourself in check if you don't trust your own spacing, or if you need it to be perfect. I don't need mine to be perfect. So I'm obviously have a little bit of different spacing. But if you need yours to be perfect, then you can measure it. Move that down just a tad. Grabbing that V. And I'll probably do about 3 more of these, maybe 2, we'll see. It is kind of like the lazy daisy. So Jennifer in the chat said that a lazy daisy, and I can show you what that one looks like too, is very much like this, except we're making like a V instead of making a petal of a daisy. So this very same technique of kind of tacking down that loop is what helps create both of those stitches. I'm going to do this last one. Don't want to lose track. And put it at the very bottom of my letter B. There we go. And I've completed that column. This is what my other side of those feather stitches look like. And I'm going to go back through 1 or 2 of those and kind of slide my needle underneath them in order to help me make a really nice secure knot at the end of my work. And then I can cut that down. And let me show you a little bit of lazy daisy, just because why not? We're on a roll. So with the lazy daisy, it's also similar to something called the chain stitch. it would be a really great Mother's Day embellish with beads. So I'm going to tie a knot in this so that it doesn't come out. And this is just kind of extra. So if you're following me exactly, you don't need to do this part. I just want to kind of show you. I'm tying the knot so that my work doesn't come through. And then the lazy daisy kind of starts very similar to the feather, except the feather spreads out the stitch and the lazy daisy is going to go back almost exactly where your stitch just came up. But before we go ahead and pull this all the way through, you're going to form like a petal. So notice how I kept it like a loop, and you want to stitch the loop down. So I'm going to poke up through on the inside of that loop and pull. And then I'm going to poke down through on the other side of that loop and pull. And you can tell that I've created like a petal-like shape. So I can come up through that same center and I can make my next petal by going down to about the same spot and just holding on to this thread before you let it go all the way through and keeping a nice petal. Trying to keep my petal from twisting. There we go. And I'm going to try and make my petal about the same length. I'm going to come up, make that a little bit wider. And I'm going to tack that down by going on the other side of the loop. And so you can imagine that you can keep going around and making the complete daisy by adding all those petals in. Right now, this kind of looks like a bumblebee, which is kind of working for my particular pattern. So I might even keep that. Or you can tell that it almost looks like a nice heart too. I love that. So yeah, when you do the daisy and when you complete all the way around the circle, you can always add a bead into the center to really make it look like a flower or really make it look like a daisy. So that's a great suggestion and a great idea. Yes, you can change that lazy daisy into a shamrock for St. Patrick's Day as well. So I'm going to stop on the daisy. I might come back to it and finish it off. But I'm going to teach you the last stitch I wanted to make sure that I showed you today, which is called a French knot. So French knots, those of us who have ever been into cross stitch at any point in your life, you've probably come across a French knot before because we use French knots a lot when we're doing eyes. So if you're doing some kind of design where it has an animal or a person and you need some eyeballs, that's usually where a French knot comes into play for cross stitch. But we're going to be using it to kind of embellish our particular work. So here we go for a French knot. A French knot is going to give us a dimensional knot that kind of sticks out of the fabric and really kind of gives you some nice texture. You can see how those come away from the fabric pretty nicely. And just add something fun. So I'm going to come up anywhere I want to on my hoop. And in order to create a French knot, it can be tricky at first, so don't give up. But what you're going to want to do is you're going to take your needle and you're going to take your thread and you're going to keep your needle as close to your fabric and your hoop as you can. And you're going to wrap 1, 2, 3, wrap that floss around your needle 3 times. And then you're going to take the needle and you're going to poke back through as closely as you can to that original stitch. And then as I pull this gently through, that creates our French knot. And this knot can kind of be moved around just a tiny bit if you need it to go in a certain direction to be an eye or something like that. You can do that. I'm going to need some more thread before I show you this one again. So let me tie this off. I left a long enough string when I started to be able to kind of tie these 2 ends together to secure them. And you might have noticed when I was holding up my other work before that if I hold it up in the light, you might be able to see that I did drag my French knots around. So you might be able to see some of that black thread popping through. So if you're worried about your fabric being really light, then you can stop after each French knot and tie each one of those off separately. I obviously didn't have the patience to tie each one off separately. And if I wanted to, at the end of my work, I can put another piece of fabric behind it, and then you're not going to be able to see through, and you're not going to be able to see all those stitches I kind of dragged around as much, and definitely not in the light. I have a lot of light right now for the class, but yeah. So there's another question in the chat asking about wooden hoops versus plastic hoops. And honestly, both of them work. I tend to go old school with my wooden hoop a lot more often than the plastic hoops. And once you have your work finished, I like the way a wooden hoop looks. And if you want to leave your work in your hoop when you're finished, then that's probably what matters the most if you want it to be wood or plastic. One thing you can do with this wood is you can paint on it, whereas you might not be able to paint onto a plastic. So if I wanted to pick out one of the colors and kind of paint this to finish it, I could. You can also add a little piece of lace, add a little piece of trim, add a little piece of felt if you want kind of like a little border to go around your work, and then you can hang it on your wall and have something kind of nice. Or there's some really cool kind of like photo stand holders where you can place it in and kind of have it on a desk or something displayed as well. But I think the wood is nice for finished projects. I think it looks a little bit better than the plastic, but both work very well. So feel free. And then someone reminded us that, hey, you could use your wood burning kit on this wooden frame and you could add a little touch of like, to somebody from Megan, I made you this, you're welcome. I knew that you wanted a sweater. So I made you a sweater. All right, I'm gonna keep going. And I'm going to make a couple more French knots. And I'm also going to go ahead and finish off my letter B with some more backstitch and with some more of my running stitch. But we are doing great on time, so feel free to ask questions in the chat if you want to take me on a little sidetrack journey. I'm willing to go with you because we have some time today. Maybe I can throw in a couple of extra bonus stitches too. So let me go ahead and thread my needle again. And I've gotten lucky so far being able to do it on camera in front of all of you, but I don't want to jinx it. There we go. I'm going to tie a little knot towards the end, and I'm going to show you that French knot again, and maybe try and hold it up a little closer so you can see it better. And yes, this French knot can absolutely be used in the center of your lazy daisy also, so keep that in mind. And you can do the French knot using yarn as well, or something thicker if you want these eyes or things to be thicker. All right, I'm going to poke up through wherever I want to and pull until I hit the back. And then when you're doing this, I'm going to have the thread in my left hand. I have my needle in my right hand because I am right-handed. And like I said before, I'm going to try and keep this needle as close to the fabric as I possibly can. And I'm going to wrap 1, 2, 3 times. You can wrap 4, you can wrap 5, you can wrap as many as you want, but usually 3 is what most people do. And then you're just going to need the tip of your needle to poke back through the fabric. And then you're gently going to pull all of this embroidery floss through that knot that you've just created by doing those wraps. And once again, we have another French knot. So if you want to, you can pop up another spot nearby and do another French knot. Notice how you can see that a little bit because my fabric is kind of light, so I can avoid that if I want to, but I'm not going to be too particular right now. And I'm going to do this process again. I'm holding my needle in my right hand. I'm wrapping 1, 2, 3, and I'm trying to keep my needle as close to my fabric as I possibly can. And then I kind of need to pull my needle back in order to get the tip of my needle to go through very close to where I started my knot. Then I'm going to pull this all the way through. And there we go. And that's another French knot. I have also there's someone in the chat who said they've been inspired by Beat It embroidery. Me too. So, Felicia, I don't know if you can help me, but on YouTube, we have the class that you and I were looking at the other day. I can't remember. If we can find it, we'll try and get it for you. But we had a really great instructor come on and show how to add beads to your embroidery. I think it was last month, and we should have that video on the Michael's YouTube, but she did a really great job. And she used some of these similar stitches actually. So if you know how to do this feather or fly stitch, I think she used that to create cool like vines to make like kind of floral things coming out of jean jacket pockets and things like that. So that's another great idea. So yeah, let's go ahead and do another stitch since we have some time. So I'm going to show you the chain stitch, and the chain stitch is very similar to the lazy daisy and kind of to this fly stitch I've been working in the middle. So for the chain stitch, what's going to happen is I'm going to come up through my fabric, and then I'm going to go down through that same spot. But just like the fly stitch and the lazy daisy, I don't want this stitch to go all the way through. So I want to kind of put my finger somewhere to kind of catch it from going all the way through. And then for the chain stitch, what you're going to do is you're going to pop up through a little bit forward, and you're going to grab it just like you did for your letter V, but you're going to let it lay down flat instead of leaving it open for a daisy or leaving it as a V. So you lay it down flat and then you tack it by going right next to it. And then you've created the first part of your chain. You're going to come up very close to where you just left off. You can even come up inside of it. I'm going to come up inside that loop just a little bit, if I can get in there. Gonna need my glasses. There we go. All right, I'm coming up through the loop that I just laid down, and I'm going to go back on the other side of the loop. And this is how you can continue these loops into one continuous chain stitch. And I'm going to stop this stitch from coming all the way down and keep it from twisting too much. And before this stitch comes all the way down, I am going to grab a stitch. So I'm going to put a stitch maybe about 1 centimeter away from my other one. And this is going to keep that loop on track with the letter B. And see how I pulled it tighter so that it didn't leave too much of a loop. It looks just like a very, very thick line. And this time when I come down through, I'm going to come on the other side of the loop I just made. And this can be a continuous stitch. So I'm already starting my next loop, and I'm coming up about 1 centimeter away again. Awesome. The name of the class I was talking about was a John Bead class, and it's called Bead Embroiderer for Clothing and Accessories. So you can find that on the Michael's YouTube channel. And if you're watching with us live right now, Felicia just put that into the chat for you to be able to click on. I'm stopping the loop by putting in my next stitch. So this chain stitch that I'm doing right now is the stitch that people have been using a lot lately on sweaters. So you may have seen people like adding the names of their kids in cursive onto sweaters with yarn. This chain stitch is what people are using to do that because it makes a really nice thick stitch, kind of like double layered. So you don't have to do a lot of work to get a really nice result. And people are using tapestry needles, which are bigger, obviously, than the embroidery needles, and yarn, and going through a sweater and doing exactly what I'm doing right now. I think I have about 1 more of these stitches to come through on this part of the bee. And I'm going down on the other side of the loop And I'm going to tack down my last stitch at that center portion of the bee. And then I think I saw in the chat too an interest in something called the split stitch, which is pretty similar to what we're doing. And there we go. So I'm going to pull that a little closer. You can see all those tiny little, almost petals, similar to the lazy daisy, but I pulled them down pretty thin instead of leaving them loopy. And so that's what was able to get me that really nice chain stitch. The chain stitch is great for cursive writing and things like that that are pretty continuous. So now that I have this finished, I'm going to go back through 1 or 2 stitches. And I'm going to tie this off. Now the split stitch is similar to the chain stitch, except instead of making 2 rows, because you have this petal like where it has thread on this side and thread on this side, the split stitch is going to go back through the same piece of thread and literally split the strands of the embroidery floss. So the floss that I'm currently using that's kind of curved and kind of braided is not going to be able to split because it doesn't have several strands. So I'm going to need to switch over to my floss that has 6 strands to be able to show you the split stitch. And I'm going to cut just a little bit of that. And when I split the stitch, I'm going to have 6 strands. So I'm going to split it as best I can, 3 and 3. We'll see if my eyeballs can do this. I don't have my glasses on. And usually when I'm embroidering, I'm definitely keeping my work close to my face. But when I'm filming with you right now, I'm holding it so that y'all can see it. So it makes it tougher on my eyeballs. I'm just telling you all my excuses in case this doesn't work. That's what I'm really doing. All right, here I go, trying to thread this. Ooh, I got lucky. Got all 6 strands through my needle. I have a knot on the end. And here we go. So I'm going to come up and I'm going to go down, and this is just like the running stitch, the back stitch, and so many other stitches we've done before. Now, the difference with the split stitch is we're going to go back to the stitch that we just did, and I'm going to separate those teeny tiny strands into 3 and 3, and I am going to do just what the name of the stitch says. I'm going to split that stitch. So I'm kind of turning that stitch into its own loop, and I'm coming through the middle of that stitch. Let's see if I can show you. I might not have split it perfectly. There we go. So I'm coming up through the middle of this stitch, and I have some of the strands on the right and some of the strands on the left of my needle. And then I'm going to go down a little bit farther than the end of the next stitch. So I'm kind of overlapping the stitches. And that split, I'm going to come up through the center of this next stitch, and I'm going to split some of the strands on one side of the needle and some of the strands on the other side of the needle. And I'm going to go a little further than the last stitch. And so the point of the split stitch is to come up through the center of the stitch before and split your threads 3 and 3. And you're still creating a pretty thick lettering, so it's good for outlining. It also, if you need to save on embroidery floss, which some of you, it sounds like, don't need to because you have plenty. If you're running out of a certain color, you can use this stitch rather than the chain stitch because it's going to be less floss than a chain stitch. I'm going to try and split this one more time, see if I can do it. And if I was doing this with my, that would be, there we go. And I'm going to put it through one more time. There we go. And that is the split stitch. So the split stitch is pretty similar to the chain stitch. It's a little bit thinner because it's going back through one of the strands and separating out the different strands, whereas this one has kind of 2 layers, one on each side, in order to complete that. It does work really well for outlining, so it really makes a nice look for my letter B. And then I have just a little bit more someone had mentioned the satin stitch too, and I showed you the satin stitch at the top of the class on this base. So I used the French knots, I used my running stitch, I used my back stitch, and then up here I used the satin stitch. And the satin stitch does take a lot of time, but it really fills in a space very, very nicely. So let me tie this last knot, and then I'll show you a little bit of that satin stitch. If there's any other stitches you can think of right now that you think I might be able to help you with, we have a little bit of time left, but I think we're doing great on our sampler. We've got a lot of different things to play with, so you can kind of take these and run with them. And whatever kind of stencils you have and you want to do, I love floral embroidery. I think that's just pretty natural to do with your embroidery, but there's lots of different options for that too. All right, for the satin stitch, I'm going to add on to my sampler. I'm going to draw myself a little heart. And I kind of like that this one already looks like a heart. So I'm going to put another little heart maybe right here. So I have this heart up here, and I'm going to fill this heart in with the satin stitch. So you can start wherever you want to. I'm going to start on the right hand side of the heart, and I'm going to go across, and I'm going to make all my stitches go horizontally. You could make some of your stitches go to each of these diagonals to fill in the heart. There's lots of different ways to fill it in. And yes, changing your thread can change the texture and can add some really interesting elements to it too. So that's one stitch going across. And then because I left off right here, you don't want to come up right next to that because it might pull the fabric apart. So when you're doing your satin stitch and you have so many stitches so close together, you want to kind of leave some space, or I'm going to jump back to the other side where I first started. So over to the right side of my heart and start over there rather than coming back up close to where I left off, because I don't want to rip my fabric. So I'm going to kind of keep coming from the right to the left and from the right to the left several times. And I'm putting my stitches pretty close together in order to fill in that space. That's what the satin stitch is all about. And obviously each time my stitches are getting a little shorter in order to create the bottom of that heart. Maybe one more. And then I'm going to keep the same thread I have, the same momentum. And I'm going to go up to the top, and I'm going to fill in the left-hand side of the heart first. And I'm matching all of those stitches kind of going in the same direction horizontally. And if you skip a little, if you have a little space in between, you can come back and fill that in with another stitch. Maybe one more to finish the top. And then I'm going to go to the other side of my heart. And I'm going to do the same thing, popping up on the right-hand side and going over. Popping up on the right-hand side and filling in that little bit of gap I left. There we go. A little bit more on the top. And then I think we have a really sweet little heart here. Awesome. Adorable. So that satin stitch really filled all of those gaps in, whereas you can tell that this one is more outlined with our daisy, and this one's a lot more solid. So that can really take it takes a lot of floss, but it does have a beautiful finish. So whatever you think you might use that for to fill in, you can definitely do that. Tie a little knot. And then, yeah, let's go ahead and show a finish. If I wanted to keep this in the hoop, I'm going to find a floss maybe a yellow that's a little closer. It's not exactly, but it's a little closer to what my fabric is. And I'm going to finish off the back of this with the running stitch. And I'm going to pull that running stitch in order to kind of close this in on itself. And that's what I did with the sweater, so that when I have my finished hoop, you have something kind of nice that looks nice on this side with not a lot of extra fabric hanging out. So I'm going to take my thread through my needle. And if you are working on something at home, I would love to see what you're working on. So we have our Michael's Learn with Michael's Instagram that focuses on all of our classes. And so if you tag us on Instagram at Learn with Michael's, we'll be able to share your creations with the world. So I would love to see what you're doing. Feel free to tag me also on my personal Instagram at 4M Coleman. And you can see some of my finished products on there. Don't forget to join me next week when we do the embellished photography, because I think you're really going to like that one too. So the goal of this last bit is to get all of this fabric to kind of scooch together. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a running stitch about an inch away from the hoop. So remember, the running stitch is just going up and down and leaving that dashed line. And you can make these stitches pretty far away from each other. And you can make them pretty loosey-goosey, and they definitely don't need to be perfect, because we're just doing this to kind of make almost like a drawstring. And the drawstring is going to kind of draw all of this fabric towards the center. So I'm stitching around the whole entire hoop, probably about an inch long running stitch. It's also, if you sew it all, like a basting stitch is basically the running stitch as well. Maybe a couple more. And then I'm going to pull on this floss and kind of gather all of this material together in the back. Here we go. The grand finale. Going to pull this, and you'll notice how this all kind of closes up on itself. Might need to pull a little closer to the beginning to grab this stuff. There we go. And then we're able to kind of let that fold over top of each other. You can cut this excess down. You can hot glue it. Just be careful not to let the hot glue show on the other side. And then I also sometimes take my extra thread and kind of sew a couple of these pieces together just to kind of keep it nice and flat. And then it's going to give you a really nice finish on your finished piece that you can then hang on a wall. You can add a little ribbon. You can put some rickrack. You can decorate the wood. You can paint the wood. There's so many different things that you can do with this. So I think we've reached the end of our class for today, and I'm so glad that so many of you were able to join me. So I hope that you come back and do some more of our embroidery classes, whether it's with me next week or some of the classes that are already available on YouTube. Dig into Embroidery Month this February and have lots of fun with all your new embroidery stitches. Have fun, share with us at Learn with Michaels, and thanks for coming. I had a really great time, and I hope you did too. Bye, everyone.